This behind me is a memorial to engineers. There are many monuments like this in Southampton, but this is no different. This is one of the many memorials that are dedicated to people who have sacrificed their lives during one of the biggest disasters in history. This memorial behind me is called the Engineers Memorial, and it is in tribute to the engineers who have tragically lost their lives on a ship, the biggest ship of its time, the Titanic.
Over a century ago, the Titanic sank at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, claiming 1,500 lives. In one of the most tragic peaceful maritime disasters in history, the story of the Titanic has never failed to capture the minds and the hearts of many people. In this documentary, I will be discussing the events of the infamous story and reflect on how the disaster had challenged mankind and how nature responded to this overruling dominance.
They didn't actually know that she was truly sinking for almost an hour.
I will be taking you on a journey from the ship's berth to her wreck underneath the sea.
She thought he was dead.
God himself could not sink the ship.
I will be interviewing various guests as they share their theories and tell the stories of survivors whose voices played important roles in the Titanic's life and death.
You want to listen to those stories, and in order to get the stories in the purest form, you don't want to disturb anything.
Together, we will be retelling the ship's story in a whole new light.
This is Titanic, Titan of the Sea.
In the county of Monmouthshire in Wales, a distress call was heard on an apparatus inside a mill. CQD, CQD, SOS, D, MGY, position 41.44 north, 50.24 west. This call came from Artie Moore's apparatus. Being only a Marconi enthusiast, Artie could not believe what he heard. He wrote down the Morse signals, the vessel's name, and her position. When the signals faded out, Artie hurried to the local police station to tell them what happened. Nobody believed him, thinking that Artie was making a joke. But this was no laughing matter. Soon the word spread, with the codes heard by many ships, Cape Race, the press, and the White Star Line. Rumours began to spread, and, in haste, residents worldwide, including Southampton and New York, went over to the White Star Line offices asking for information. Overwhelmed with the public and their questions, employees at the White Star Line offices did everything they could to try and get information from the company and relatives of the passengers and crew. Outside the offices, the world began to mourn their loved ones. In Southampton, many women continued to stand outside the offices wearing black clothing and holding candles in the night time. And in New York, some crowds had begun to head towards Pier 54, standing in the rain and waiting for the rescue ship to arrive. In the following days, stories began to print, investigations would begin, and the people would ask survivors to sign autographs. In the weeks, days, hours and minutes were a waiting game. But by the time these events were happening, the world knew what had happened. They happened because of a disaster, which involved an accident at sea. And the name of the ship involved was the RMS Titanic. The The Titanic was travelling at a speed of 22 knots when she suddenly collided with an iceberg on her starboard side. When she collided with the iceberg, the cold ice sliced open 6 out of her 16 watertight compartments. In under 3 hours, the ship would sink underneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Out of the 2,208 people on board, only 712 would survive that terrible night. But what happened on the late night of April 14th and the early morning of the 15th of April? In this episode, we are going to touch on the story from the collision to the final plunge. In most clips, I will show you the real-time footage of the sinking made by Thomas Linsky and his team over at Part-Time Explorer, who I wish to thank for allowing me to use the footage for the documentary. While watching, I was able to re-look at the video of the sinking based on the events from the book On a Sea of Glass. After gathering my research, I will begin to narrate the story, and with the inclusion of my guests, we will also be sharing stories from Edith Brown Haseman, Arthur John Priest, Eloise Smith, and more. On the night of the 14th of April, the Titanic was travelling at the speed of 22 knots, and all was quiet. The evening was drawing to a close, and by that time, most passengers began to get ready for bed. All was peaceful on the deck, despite the crewmen feeling the chilly air in the Atlantic Ocean. Suddenly, at 11:39 p.m, 3 sharp bells rang from the crow's nest. On the roof of the first-class lounge, standby quartermaster Alfred Oliver was still on duty working on the compass when he heard the bell ringing up in the crow's nest. In the wheelhouse, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens too heard the bell. This was unusual, and it was one that had alarmed the crew, for 3 bells meant danger. When the bell was heard by those still on duty, a telephone mounted on the aft wall inside the wheelhouse began to ring. Immediately, Second Officer James Moody picked up the phone before he heard a distressed voice from one of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet. "Is anyone there?" cried Fleet. "Yes," replied Moody. "What do you see?" "Iceberg, right ahead." "Thank you." Moody told First Officer William Murdoch, but after waiting for a response from Moody, Murdoch, who likely saw the iceberg before the lookouts did, rushed to the bridge of the ship before giving the order hard to starboard. When he reached the engine order telegraph, he grabbed the twin handles, attempting to reverse the engines and ordering the engineers to stop all engines. Hitchens was waiting for an order to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg, and when Murdoch turned the telegraph, he threw his weight onto the wheel, trying to turn the ship to her right. Holding their breaths, they hoped that the Titanic's rudder would gravitate itself away from the iceberg and clear it. However, the rudder was still turning starboard, heading towards it. Spotting it too late, and with the fact that a ship's rudder doesn't turn a ship but rather moves in the direction of lower pressure, the stern moved one way and the bow moved in the opposite direction. Then there were cries of "Hard aboard!" The impact took 37 seconds, and during that time a lot of scraping, grinding and bumping noises were heard below the waterline. The rivets on the starboard side began to pop, and, like her sister ship with the HMS Hawke collision, the metal on the Titanic's hull became dented, leaving a long line in between the bow and boiler room number 5. The noise became so deafening that it gave some of the crew members the impression that the accident was serious, and some thought that the ship wasn't going to stay afloat much longer.
Close the watertight doors and stop the engines. Send for the carpenter. Mr. Boxhall, head below decks forward and inspect for damage.
In his own words from a BBC interview recorded in 1936, Second Officer Charles Lightoller gives his own account of the iceberg collision.
Murdoch evidently saw the mass of ice practically at the same time as the lookout men and shouted, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern." His idea was to swing her bow clear and then put the helm hard over the other way and so swing her stern clear. And given half a chance, I believe he'd have done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck.
The trouble was that he didn't see what he had explained. At the time of the collision, he was in bed. Whether it was just speculation or rumours that he heard from later resources, it's hard to explain. But one person who saw the iceberg was Edith Russell. Edith was in her cabin and was turning in for the night when she saw a white shape gliding rapidly past her window. After this, Edith slipped on her coat and ran out on the deck to see what all the commotion was about. She stood with 5 other passengers, and standing on the rail, Edith saw fragments on the deck. In a 1979 interview with the British Pathé, Edith explains what happened when she and the rest of the passengers had heard.
There was a very slight bump, just a little jar, nothing at all. I went in my room. There was a second light jar, nothing of consequence. But you knew something had happened, and one man said, "Look at that. That's an iceberg, and it's a whopper, because you know, there's 1/8 above the water and 7/8 below, and this blooming thing's all the way over the top of the ship." Thought nothing of it. We picked up the bits of ice, and most of us prayed snowballs.
Most people on A deck heard or felt the iceberg movement or saw the iceberg, and although it caused some excitement and concern, some passengers thought that the collision wasn't serious. Following the collision, an order was given to close the watertight doors before alerting Captain Smith of the situation. The crew was silent and they were in shock. They had witnessed a 15,000-year-old iceberg slicing the metal of an 11-month-old ship, something unimaginable to believe. When the silence was on the bridge, Captain Smith came onto the deck and stood beside Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall. "What have we struck?" he asked Murdoch. "An iceberg, sir. I put her to hard a starboard and run engines full astern, but it was too close." The captain then asked if Murdoch closed the watertight doors and ran the warning bell, to which he said yes. Meanwhile, on D-deck, Lawrence Beasley had noticed that the engines had slowed down and stopped moments after the collision.
I retired to my cabin at about 11:15. I'd been fortunate enough to secure a 2-berth cabin to myself, D56, quite close to the saloon and most convenient in every way for getting about the ship. After undressing and climbing into the top berth, I read from about 11:15 to about 12:15. During this time, I noticed particularly the increased vibration of the ship, and I assumed we were going at a higher speed than at any time since we sailed from Queenstown. And then, in the quietness of the night, broken only by the muffled sound that came to me through the ventilators of stewards talking and moving along the corridors, there came what seemed nothing more than an extra heave of the engines and a more than usually obvious dancing motion of the mattress on which I sat. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash or anything else. No sense of shock. No jar that felt like one heavy mass meeting another. And presently the same thing repeated, with about the same intensity. I jumped out of bed and slipped on a dressing gown over my pyjamas, put on shoes and went out of my cabin into the hall near the saloon. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the vestibule door to the top deck, and stepped out into an atmosphere that cut me like a knife. Walking to the starboard side, I peered over and saw the sea some 70 feet below, calm and black. Forward, the deserted deck stretching away to the first-class quarters and the captain's bridge, and behind, the steerage quarters and the stern bridge. Nothing more. No iceberg on either side or astern as far as we could see in the darkness.
At 11:43 p.m, Captain Smith rings down on the engine order telegraphs for Hearth ahead. Then the Titanic travelled at a slower speed between 4 to 6 knots. When the ship's engines stopped 2 minutes after the impact, shopkeeper Frank Prentice was in his cabin when he noticed that something was wrong. At nearly 11:45 p.m, Frank bumped into his colleague Samuel Hemming, who was the lamp trimmer of the Titanic. Before they bumped into each other, Samuel heard a hissing noise. Alarmed and wondering if the ship was taking on water, the pair went down to the forecastle head. When they got there, Samuel opened the hatch to the forepeak storeroom up on Orp deck. When they investigated the situation and stopped on top of the tank, they found that the room and the tank were dry. The hissing continued, but the problem was solved when Samuel discovered that out of the exhaust pipe there was air escaping. It was informed to Chief Officer Henry Wilde, but rather than looking it further, Samuel and Frank left the storeroom and went back to bed. The Titanic's engines had stopped for the last time at 11:46 p.m. and by this time some passengers who didn't feel the collision noticed the ship wasn't moving.
We retired about 10 o'clock, and I was sleeping peacefully when I was awakened, not by the collision with the iceberg, but by the stillness of the boat. I thought, what in the world is the engine stopped this time of night for? So I put a raincoat on over my pajamas and went out on the deck and saw a sailor looking over into the water, and I said, what's wrong? Oh, he said, we bumped into an iceberg. Didn't do any harm, I guess.
When Albert went back to bed, Thomas Andrews, who was the Titanic's designer, was leaving his stateroom following the collision. Little is known about Andrews and what his reaction was, and it was unclear to see if he saw the iceberg from his rooms or somewhere else. But it could have been a possibility. However, first-class passenger Eleanor Casper recalled Andrews leaving his stateroom on A deck immediately. As he walked, he was overcrowded with people asking him questions. He answered their questions, reassuring them that everyone is safe and that the Titanic was absolutely unsinkable. He then went on to say that because of the collision, she could break into 3 separate and distinct parts and that each part would stay afloat indefinitely. At 11:50 p.m, Andrews was racing down a flight of stairs down to G deck and heading towards the engine room. When he saw the engine room, the water was flooding the room. The gash inside the hole sent a large amount of water into boiler room 6. When Captain Smith joined Andrews on G deck, they had learnt that cargo holds 1, 2 and 3 were taking on water. And with the water continuing to rise from the boilers to the stairs on G deck, the situation became desperate, and it didn't take long for Andrews to answer the questions the passengers had asked him moments earlier.
When the Titanic started going down, they didn't actually know that she was truly sinking for almost an hour. It took them that long to actually assess the damages because the ship was just on the verge of surviving, believe it or not. Had the damage extended not quite so far, maybe like 5 feet shorter, Titanic possibly could have survived.
Later, Andrews told a young survivor and his parents that the ship would sink in an hour. Inside her cabin, C-31, Mary Louise Smith was asleep when she was awoken by the iceberg collision. She went back to sleep unalarmed. Esther Hart also felt the collision, but having heard and felt a bump the night before, Benjamin wasn't happy with Esther trying to make him get out of bed while she was still wide awake. "Daddy," she called her husband, Get up at once. We have hit something, I am sure, and it's serious." Annoyed, Benjamin did what his wife had asked, and believing it was nothing serious, he went up on deck. When he got back, he did explain that there was a lifeboat drill. Esther didn't believe a word of it, and giving in to her feelings, she and Eva decided to leave their cabin and went up on deck. Back in her cabin, Eloise woke up for a second time. She suddenly felt and heard the engine stop, and she grew concerned. She then got out of bed to investigate. While walking, she bumped into her husband, Lucien. He escorted his wife back into their cabin, where he told her about the collision. "It does not amount to anything, but will probably delay us a day getting into New York." He then encouraged her to dress warmly before they went up on deck. She dressed warmly, and while doing so, Lucien decided to eat an apple. Eloise complained that he wrapped her up too warmly. In response, Lucien said that he could not afford to have a new wife catching a cold. Eloise then said to him, "You know the boat has struck and is sinking." Edith Russell was about to go to bed again when, at 12:20 a.m., when she was about to turn in, she heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, she saw a familiar face who said to her that there was an order to put on lifebelts. "What in the world for?" she asked the familiar face, who turned out to be a man. "I haven't an idea," he replied. Edith became frustrated about a lifeboat drill in the middle of the night, but nonetheless she left her cabin. On her way to the lounge, she bumped into her bedroom steward and began to complain about the situation. She stopped complaining in mid-sentence and asking if everyone was in danger. The steward was confident that the Titanic was unsinkable, but Edith noticed that the tone of his voice and the look in his eyes said it all. Realizing that the ship was sinking, Edith thought about her belongings and asked if the ship sinks, will the crew allow her to board a lifeboat with them? In response, the steward said, "If I were you, I'd go back to your room and kiss your lovely things goodbye." Edith and her bedroom steward ran back to her cabin. Although she left everything behind, Edith asked him to pick up a mascot pig that she owned. He did so, and when he did, Edith held onto the pig while waiting in the lounge. Edith Brown Haseman and her family were still in their cabin during and after the collision. Thomas went on deck to see what happened, and when he came back a few minutes later, he said that Edith and Elizabeth should start putting their lifebelts on and something warm.
He said to them when he knocked on their door, he said, first of all, he just warned them. He said, "There's talk that there's ship has struck an iceberg, but I'll go up top and see what I can find out." And then later, about 5-10 minutes later, he said, "You'd better come on deck and put all your warm clothes on. Everyone's assembling up on deck." And the stewards then were going around the alleyways, banging the doors, saying, "Everybody up. Want you up top, got to get upstairs just in case."
By the time the steward had knocked on the Browns' cabin door, stewards were beginning to knock on all passengers' doors. All first and second class passengers were ordered to go up on deck and to wait until further instructions. However, it was a very different story for third class passengers. Leah Ask was in bed when she heard the commotion.
She was preparing for bed. She wasn't really asleep yet, but someone knocked on her door. Probably one of these young women that she had made friends with, maybe her age, or who had a baby as well, and said, "Do you know the ship hit something?" And she said, "No, I had no idea." And so she said, "Well, our children are sleeping. Let's just go up and have a look." So the two of them walked up to the aft well deck, and there was nobody except a few crewmen. And they said, "Is the ship in any danger?" And the crewman said, "No, of course not. Not at all. Go back to bed."
But what Leah didn't know was that down on G deck, the water had already reached the post office, the squash court, and the baggage rooms. Water was also flooding Scotland Road and third-class cabins on both G and F decks. By 12:05 a.m, the level of the water was rising very high in the Turkish baths and swimming pool. Although it took an hour to realise the horror of the situation from most people on board, some crew members had begun preparing for evacuation. Unfortunately, this was carried out at a slow pace, an action that would cause confusion and delay, and one that would result a great loss of life. It all started with the preparation of the lifeboats on both sides of the ship. When the preparations had begun, Murdoch gave the order to get the seamen together and uncover the lifeboats and turn them out as quietly as though nothing had happened. At around midnight, Chief Officer Wilde ordered Boxhall to wake up Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who was in his cabin. Following Wilde's orders, Boxhall hurried to Lightoller's cabin. When Boxhall opened the door, Lightoller had already returned to his cabin after investigating the decks, having felt the collision 20 minutes earlier.
I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited. It wasn't long before Boxhall, the fourth officer, poked his head round my door and said, "Do you know we've struck an iceberg?" "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking it anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater and bridge coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was.
Wilde ordered Lightoller to report to the starboard side to begin the evacuation of the lifeboats. However, the three men and the rest of the crew had trouble hearing each other as a deep and vibrating roar echoed around the Titanic. The problem of this came from the vent, where steam was coming out from the funnels, creating a deafening sound. Since the engines had shut down at 11:46 p.m, the steam pressure had begun to build up in the boilers, and from this, the crew could hear nothing but a deep, vibrating roar. To communicate, they either had to cover their ears with their hands, shouting, or use hand signals. The noise continued when, on the starboard side, lifeboats 7 and 5 had been launched. Before these lifeboats were launched, Captain Smith made 2 visits to the Marconi room to tell Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to wait on further instructions to send out CQD messages.
Captain Smith.
We struck an iceberg, and I'm having an inspection made to see what damage has been done to us. You'd better get ready to send out the call for help, but don't do it until I tell you.
At 12:30 a.m, Lightoller began to ask the captain if he had permission to go to the port side to start filling the lifeboats.
Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat. Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, "Why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them?"
However, it was not until 1 a.m. when Lightoller launched the first lifeboat on the port side. Around the same time that Lightoller, Wilde and the captain were filling lifeboat 8, Lucian and Eloise Smith were waiting inside the gymnasium on the boat deck. When the pair saw the same lifeboat, Lucian took Eloise and hurried towards it. When they had arrived, Lucian urged his wife to get in. While he did so, he saw a man who tried to get into the boat himself. When he saw the man, Lucien pushed him back with one hand. Then he lifted Eloise into the boat, but she protested, putting her arms around his neck while crying. Lightoller also tried to separate the couple, but Eloise refused to leave Lucien. In his interview, Lightoller shares a moment where he interacted with a young couple while trying to fill the boats.
At the time of getting away the first U-boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others. For there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat. I remember one young couple, evidently not long married, walking up and down the boat deck. I asked the girl, she was only a girl, from the western states I should say, if I should put her in a boat. But no, she wouldn't be parted from her husband. Not on your life, she said. We've started together, and we'll finish together.
He never said who this couple was, but I believe the couple he spoke to was Eloise and Lucien. Of course, that was when she might have calmed down. By the time Eloise had possibly said these words, Lifeboat 8 was gone. Then, before 1:10 a.m, Eloise saw Captain Smith with a megaphone in his hand. Refusing to leave without her husband, she asked the captain if Lucien could join her. In response, Captain Smith repeated the order, "Women and children first," through his microphone right in front of her. When he realised that he couldn't go into a lifeboat, Lucien said the following words to his wife. "I never expected to ask you to obey, but this is the one time you must. It is only a matter of form to have women and children first. The boat is thoroughly equipped, and everyone on her will be saved."
Yeah, he told a little white lie to get her into the boat. Self-sacrificing statement.
Finally giving in, Eloise made it onto lifeboat number 6. And as it sailed away, she caught the last sighting of her husband when he stood on the railing to see her and watch the lifeboat rowing away from the Titanic.
She said she could see him for a bit. He was standing with Edgar Meyer because Edgar's wife Leila also got into the boat with Eloise. They were friends. And I don't know if you know about Leila, but she was on her way home to attend her father's funeral and ended up losing her husband also in the sinking. She said she could see them standing together for a while. And as they pulled away in number 6, she thought she could see Lucien, darting along the deck, helping people in the boats. But it's probably, it would be very difficult to discern him on the deck.
With Eloise safe on lifeboat number 6, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued sending distress signals. A few ships had answered them, saying that they would either be on standby or they would tell their captain to begin preparations to head their way. One of them was the Carpathia. The story goes that when the ship's operator, Harold Cottam, was tying his shoelaces while still having his headset on, he picked up the distress signal from the Titanic. In an interview that was recorded in 1957 from the BBC, Harold Cottam described what happened when he heard the signal.
She didn't call me, I called her. About 1 o'clock in the morning, after I'd taken the press, or listened to the press, I took a batch of message for her, and with the intention of redirecting them on to her, I called her up. And the only reply I got that she'd struck ice. And I said, was it serious? And she said, yes, this is a CQD, old man. Here's the position, report it and get here as soon as you can. So I took the position and on a scrap of paper and rushed up to the bridge with it. When I got on the bridge, I contacted the officer of the watch, and the information didn't seem as though it had sunk as fast as I thought it ought to, so I rushed down the ladder and knocked on the captain's cabin, and as I saw a light I rushed in, and he said, who the hell, or words to that effect. And so I said, well, the Titanic struck ice, sir, and she's in distress. I've got the position here. So he said, well, give it me, and he put a dressing gown on and went. So he said, will you confirm this? Go aft and confirm it if you can. When I came back, he said, well, you you'd better go back and tell her that we're going to double bank all the watches on deck and below, and tell him we're on our way, fast as you could go.
The Carpathia then made her way to the Titanic. She was on her way from New York City to Croatia when Harold Cotton sent the call. It was lucky that they left the city days before, but it was unfortunate that she was not the closest ship. When Captain Smith received a reply, Captain Arthur Rostrom said they would be at the site in 4 hours. By then, it would be too late. At 1:25 a.m, near lifeboat number 14, Thomas, Elizabeth and Edith had waited on deck. When Thomas was able to get access to the lifeboat, he kissed them and watched his wife and daughter climb in.
My father said, "You go up on deck and see what's wrong." So he went up on deck and he came back. He says, "You better get dressed and come up on deck." He says, they've only struck an iceberg, you see. So anyway, he heard some more news that we had to stay up on deck, and he put a life belt on my mother and I. And we waited there, and an officer come along and says, "Women and children first." And he said, all the boats start being put out.
When Edith and Elizabeth entered lifeboat number 14, they were assisted by Benjamin Hart. Benjamin had volunteered to help women and children. When Esther jumped in, an unnamed officer noticed a man climbing in, and in anger, he told the man to get out. He then fired his revolver into the air to let people know that the boat was full, before shouting, "Stand back! I say stand back! The next man who puts his foot in this boat, I will shoot him like a dog." In distress, Edith begged the officer to not shoot her daddy. Then Benjamin told the officer, "I'm not going in, but for God's sake, look after my wife and child." Before the lifeboat was lowered, Benjamin said goodbye to his wife and his daughter as he told Eva to hold Mummy's hand and be a good girl. Thomas also said goodbye to his wife and his daughter. From up above, Edith heard Thomas crying, "I'll see you in New York," before he turned his back towards them. Both Thomas and Benjamin were never seen again. Around 1:30 a.m, Albert, Sylvia and Alden were standing on deck A. Albert didn't want to put his wife and son into a lifeboat, nor did he want to go in himself. Suddenly, stokers came up on deck, and one of them was Frederick Barrett. As they met before the collision, Frederick told Albert,
"Mr. Caldwell, if you value your life, get off this ship. I've been below and the hold is filling up with water, and this ship will go down."
Albert did not want to believe Frederick's words, but this was no time for a debate. When another stoker heard Albert's arguments, he intervened by saying, "Let's say you get off the big ship now. If she's still here in the morning, you can get back on." These words convinced the Cardwells, and soon they were joined by Lawrence Beasley and Frederick Barrett.
I could see several of the boats now in the water, moving slowly away from the side without confusion or noise, and stealing away in the darkness as the crew bent to the oars. Almost immediately after this, I heard a cry from below, "Any more ladies?" I looked over the side and saw boat 13 swinging level with B-deck. The boat was almost full and about to be lowered. "No," I replied. "Well, then you'd better jump." I sat on the edge of the deck with my feet over, threw my dressing gown into the boat, and dropped into the boat near the stern.
However, something went wrong while lifeboat 13 was being lowered into the water. The small lifeboat was almost swamped by an enormous stream of water. Those in the lifeboat had to push it away from the condenser exhaust. But the wash from the exhaust caused lifeboat number 13 to drift directly underneath lifeboat number 15. Albert and Julie explain what happened during this time.
When we got out of the water, we couldn't get loose from the block and tackle. There was a lever in the center of the boat that's supposed to pull to loosen the block and tackle, but it was all gummed up with paint. We drifted back a little bit. In the meantime, boat number 16, or number 15 rather, came down on top of us, came so close that we could touch it with the bottom of both their hands.
The red paint pooled in the mechanism and had frozen there, and so there they were. The men were trying to pound the lever into submission. The women were calling up, "Stop that boat!" to number 15, but they didn't understand what that meant. Even if they could hear them, they couldn't see them. They were directly below. And so finally, when 15 was so close that they could stand on the seats and pound on the bottom, they did so. And mercifully, 15 got the message to quit lowering. And Sylvia said someone from 15 threw a knife onto 13, and the stokers used it to cut them free. And that was the only way they were able to get away.
Eventually, Frederick managed to get a knife and cut the ropes to free lifeboat 13 just in time. In the end, Frederick had saved 70 lives that night. However, crowds were scrambling and pushing to reach the rest of the lifeboats on the starboard side. To control the situation, senior officer members decided to retrieve their revolvers. The officers had collected them, and by 1:15 they would put them in their pockets before they rushed back on deck. When Edith and her steward collected her mascot pig, Edith stayed on deck. But after talking with the bridge officer, she wandered outside onto the boat deck. Suddenly, Bruce Ismay spotted Edith, and in shock, he cried, "You! What the devil are you doing here? I thought all women and children had left the ship." Ismay then seized Edith's arm before shoving her towards the stairs. When she and Ismay saw a very crowded lifeboat number 11, two men picked up Edith and carried her to the side of the boat. Screaming to get away, Edith lost both of her slippers, and the men had to pull her back on deck to retrieve them. She remained on deck, but first-class passenger Philip Mock tried to persuade her to get in. Then, unexpectedly, he did something that made Edith get into the lifeboat.
I never would have left the ship, but a sailor came along and he said, "Say you don't want to be saved? Well, I'll save your baby." And he grabbed this pig from under my arm and he tossed it in the lifeboat. And I turned to this man Monk and I said, "That does it." But when they threw that pig, I knew it was my mother calling me.
Although the lifeboat was over its capacity, this did not stop Edith from comforting cold and frightened children by pulling the tail of her toy pig, which played a tune. From hearing her interview, I can only imagine that there was a lot of gratitude from the children and the rest of the passengers. By the time lifeboat 11 left the ship, only 7 lifeboats remained on deck. There wasn't much time, and when he realised that the boats in the water were half full, Captain Smith picked up his megaphone and ordered the ships to come back to fill the spaces. However, the situation was hopeless, as many people did not want to follow the captain's orders because they were afraid of being sucked into the sinking ship. At around 1:45 a.m, Frank Prentice was already on the port side, assisting women and children into the lifeboats. In the middle of helping as many passengers as he could, Frank was ordered to go to the storeroom and find all the biscuits that he and the other storekeepers could find. When he returned on A deck, he, like Jack Thayer, found himself trapped in a large crowd. As Frank tried to reach the boat deck, he could see that passengers, including men, were trying to get into the last lifeboats. However, the panic grew too great that the crew members had to push the crowd back or use their revolvers again to control the panicking passengers. Somehow, Frank managed to get out of the crowd, and while he was helping, he met Virginia and Walter Clark.
Before I got my lifebelt on, I met a young couple. They'd spent their honeymoon in France, and we'd picked them up at Cherbourg. And she was having trouble with her lifebelt. So I fixed that on to her. And I said, "I think you'd better get into a lifeboat." And there was one in the port, on the port side. So she said, "No, I don't want to go there. I don't want to leave my husband." So I said, "Well, it's just precautionary measure. You get in, your husband will follow later on." And I got her away, and that was that. And then I picked up my own lifebelt and put it on.
At 1:50 a.m, the last rocket fired into the air. Leah and her friend had witnessed it going up from the deck.
She had the opportunity or good luck to have just been curious enough to go leave third class early in the accident and went up with his friend. Just probably, when you were 18, you were probably curious too, and thought, oh, this will be something to do. Let's just go up and have a look. While she was there, after the crewman said, okay, nothing happening here, go back to bed, they just hung around for a while. All of a sudden, rockets start going off, which was unexpected, to say the very least. And then they go over to the side of the ship just to look out, and she sees something that really made her blood run cold, and that was a lifeboat in the water. She went back down and they got their babies. Now, after the steam went off, woke everybody up. So now everybody's pouring up these companionways, trying to get out. And so now it's crowded. She's pushing her way through. When they made it up to the aft well deck, which was the C deck, it was crowded and everybody was panicking. Well, there was 2 staircases going up the sides, and they had a gate that was locked. It was waist high.
Leah and Frank were trapped with no hope of a way out. She had no thought about being rescued, but she and many women gave up, knowing that they and their families would never see the light of day. Suddenly, a miracle had occurred.
Some young crewmen or young men, heroic men, look down and see that these women had no means of trying to save themselves. So what happened was these heroic men, she said they were like acrobats in a circus, jumped down. There were these giant cranes, cargo cranes, and they had these big housings. And I imagined that they jumped down on these cranes, maybe then on the housing, maybe then on the hatch cover of the cargo thing. And then they formed a human ladder. There was no way she could get over it holding the baby. So somebody had to take the baby away from her so she could get across. So that's how she lost the baby, track of the baby. And so because it was so late in the sinking, they took the baby to help her. And she, out of the corner of her eye, saw somebody throwing him into a lifeboat, but she didn't see the lifeboat because the lifeboat was hanging lower and away from the ship.
Despite the separation, Leah managed to find her way up on deck to find a lifeboat, though it is unclear which number she was on. The estimated time that Leah left the ship was either at 2:05 a.m. or 2:10 a.m. By 2:10 a.m., the Titanic's stern started to rise above the ocean. At the same time, the Marconi room sent their last messages. When the last distress signal was sent and the last rocket was fired, passengers and crew began to hear a loud whistle.
This is the captain calling all boats. Return to the ship. Pull back, pull back, pull back to the ship.
In lifeboat number 2, 18 people, including 4th Officer Joseph Boxall, had made an attempt to return to the ship to pick up more passengers. It was a complete surprise for Boxall, as it turned out that lifeboat number 2 was the only lifeboat to return to the ship.
And the captain looked over the side from the bridge and sung out and told me to go round to the starboard side to the gangway doors, which was practically the opposite side to where I was lowered. I had great difficulty in getting the boat round there. There was suction. I was using the stroke oar, standing up, and there was a lady helping. She was steering the boat round the ship's stern. When I passed round the boat, try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them. But when I did eventually reach there, I found that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors. Really, I daren't go alongside, because if they'd jumped, they would have swamped the boat. She was only a small boat, would hold about 35 people. No buoyancy tanks in her at all. A boat that was always turned out ready for emergency purposes like man overboard. However, I decided that it was not, that I daren't go alongside again, and I pulled off and laid off until I pulled away about a quarter of a mile, I suppose.
As a result, the boat had abandoned any hope of rescue for other passengers who remained on the ship. With the attempt to collect the passengers from the gangway being unsuccessful, Captain Smith had lost all hope. He then left the bridge and made his way to the Marconi room, where he told Jack Phillips and Harold Bride these words.
Men, you have done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. Now it's every man for himself. Now look out for yourselves. I release you. That's the way of it at this kind of time. Every man for himself.
But Jack stayed at his post and continued to send more messages. While the messages continued, the band began to play outside the boat deck. Since midnight, Wallace Hartley and the rest of the band had been advised by Captain Smith to play to keep the passengers calm. When the ship's peril became obvious, the men took separate breaks to retrieve their lifebelts before travelling back on deck to resume playing. There are various accounts of where the band had played before 2 o'clock in the morning, but it's believed that they either played on A deck or on the promenade deck near the first class lounge. At 1:30 a.m, one survivor said that they saw the band come out on the boat deck, and when they were there, they began to play a final tune. Some survivors believe that the last tune was Autumn, while others claim it was Nearer My God to Thee.
Well, there's no question about the fact that they played, and there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are 3. I've had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after, when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church. I ran out. I knew the tune so well.
I don't doubt that they were playing music. Other people heard it. But when people say that music played as the ship went down, that is a ghastly, horrible lie.
Suddenly, the ship had taken its forward plunge, where a wave of water went up the deck and engulfed those who were in the middle of the Titanic, and some of the people who went into the sea were all 8 of the musicians. At the same time, Captain Smith had returned from the Marconi wireless room and headed towards the bridge, where he met Thomas Andrews, who was carrying a lifebelt. According to survivor testimonies, Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith were last seen on board, watching the water coming up onto the boat deck. Captain Smith then said to Andrews, "We cannot stay longer, she is going." While the actions of Captain Smith are debatable, Thomas Andrews, without question, was one of the many brave heroes during the disaster. Yet his bravery had been overshadowed by romanticism. The real story of his last minutes of life gave me respect for this man. His final minutes occurred when, at 2:05 a.m, John Stewart saw Andrews in the first class smoking room, sitting alone with his arms folded. When Stewart saw Andrews, he asked, "Aren't you going to have a try for it, Mr. Andrews?" Andrews said nothing, nor did he look at Stewart. Somehow, Andrews was trying to process everything, and one could imagine that in between his thoughts, he was in disbelief. He was stressed and heartbroken, knowing that he would never see his family again. Suddenly, something inside of him snapped. Not long after he woke himself up from his trance, Andrews ran onto the boat deck, throwing chairs and other items to those who were still in the water. Then he grabbed a lifebelt before running to the bridge, where he met the captain and jumped overboard. In memory of his bravery and reflecting on his events during that night, Horace Plunkett wrote to Andrews' father,
"I know enough to be aware that your son might easily have saved himself on the grounds of public duty none could gainsay. What better witness could be found to tell the millions who would want and had a right to know why the great ship failed, and how her successors could be made, as she was believed to be unsinkable? None of his breed could listen to such promptings of the lower self when the call came to show to what height the real man in him could rise. I think of him displaying the very highest quality of courage, the true heroism, without any of the stimulants which the glamour and prizes of battle supply, doing all he could for the women and children, and then going grimly and silently to his glorious grave.
When the two men were away from the Titanic, they would be two of the few people who would escape the ship, but sadly lose their lives. But those who remained on deck began fighting for their lives on the sinking vessel.
Then the fearful sight began. The people in the ship were just beginning to realize how great their danger was, when the forward part of the ship dropped suddenly at a faster rate, so that the upward slope became marked. There was a sudden rush of passengers on all the decks towards the stern. It was like a wave. We could see the great black mass of people in the steerage sweeping to the rear part of the boat and breaking through into the upper decks. At the distance of about a mile, we could distinguish everything through the night, which was perfectly clear. We could make out the increasing excitement on board the boat, as the people, rushing to and fro, caused the deck lights to disappear and reappear as they passed in front of them.
When the crew uncovered the last of the two collapsible lifeboats, many passengers, especially those from the third class, saw the water coming closer to the deck. Imagining that they would be safe, the passengers ran towards the stern, hoping that the stern would become an additional lifeboat of its own. On the poop deck, a large crowd began to grow. Some passengers hung onto the railings or anything else that would help them avoid the freezing water. Back down in the Marconi room, two unexpected things had happened to the two men. While Jack was still sending messages, Harold saw a stoker bursting into the room, and he was trying to steal Jack's lifebelt.
Get your body out! Get off me! I won't let you die an honorable sailor's death.
Even though it was a sudden attack, Harold had to do it, so the stoker was not a threat to his colleague. However, Harold had mentioned in an interview in the New York Times about Jack's heroic actions that night. How Phillips must work through it, I don't know. He was a brave man. I learnt to love him that night. I will never live to forget what Phillips did for the last awful 15 minutes. When the two men reached the boat deck, they tried to find the nearest lifeboat to escape the sinking vessel. However, once they were there, the pair separated, and Jack was never seen again.
John, there she is! John! John! How can I help, sir? I need you to prop that side up. Heave ho! Get me out of here! Guys! Get it off! Guys! Get this off! I can't breathe! Somebody get me out of here! There's water getting here!
Harold eventually managed to escape underneath the lifeboat and survived the night. Meanwhile, Frank Prentice ran up to the boat deck to escape the water on the ship.
We were up on the poop deck, 4 of us, and she was sinking fast then. She'd righted herself. And Rix went, and Kieran went, and I was there by myself then, thinking, and all of a sudden she lifted up quickly, and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her.
However, Second Officer Charles Lightoller had a near escape.
I turned forward and took a header from the top of the wheelhouse. I started to swim away, but got sucked down 2 or 3 times. In fact, I got mighty near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside the collapsible. We'd hove into the water from the top of the officers' quarters, and there I hung on. A bit later, the forward funnel guys carried away, and the funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft and some of us hanging onto it, by inches. But there were a good many it didn't miss. Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards away from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink.
Suddenly, passengers and crew in the lifeboats and the water had witnessed a disturbing sight.
The water had crept up almost to the captain's bridge, and it seemed a question only of minutes before she sank. The Titanic's lights still shone brightly, and I found myself wondering if those in cabins now below the surface were also ablaze. As we sat gazing at the Titanic, she tilted slowly up, revolving apparently about a centre of gravity just astern of midships, until she attained a vertically upright position. And there she remained motionless.
And then, a horrible fear was in my heart, and I think everybody else's, that the dreadful, dreadful suction that had drawn us towards the Titanic would suck us under the Titanic.
As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water. When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar, as her massive boilers all left their beds, and went crashing down through the boats' heads, and everything that stood in their way.
And I saw that ship break in half, and the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed a long time to me, and then keeled over.
Then it began to slide gently downwards. Its speed increased as it went down head first, so that the stern shot down with a rush. The lights continued to burn till it sank. We could see the people packed densely in the stern till it was gone.
And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave. And I was hanging on to a board. We had 2 boards, starboard and port, which said, keep clear of propeller blades. And I was hanging on to one of these, and I was getting higher and higher in the air. And I thought, well, now I'll go. And I dropped in. I had a lifeboat on. And I hit the water with a terrific crack. Luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. And then I looked up at the Titanic. The propellers were right out of water, the rudder was right out, and you could see the bottom. And then gradually she glided away. there. That was the last of the Titanic.
You could hear the screams of the people on the ship, you know. It was really terrible. There was a lot of men on rafts and that, frozen, you know, some of them dead. And it was very bad.
As the ship sank, we could hear the screaming a mile away. Gradually, it became fainter and fainter and died away. Some of the lifeboats that had room for more might have gone to their rescue, but it would have meant that those who were in the water would have swarmed aboard and sunk her.
However, there was a story of a man who swam for his life. Arthur John Priest, known as the unsinkable stoker, jumped into the water when the stern was high in the air. Arthur was unfortunate to wear inappropriate clothing, wearing nothing but shorts and a thin cotton shirt. Arthur screamed and cried for help, hoping that he'd be rescued.
Arthur John Priest is a very unknown character of the Titanic and other vessels that he sailed on. In fact, he didn't really speak about his times on the vessels. He was a stoker on all these ships. That was his job, and it was a hard job. It was the toughest job you could get on the vessel, because a lot of the time you'd be stuck in the boiler rooms, and there would be hot furnaces, and it was boiling hot. And in a lot of cases, it was that hot. It was as if you was. This was on a daily basis, and you would have long shifts in these rooms. And the boilers would, in fact, a lot of people would, a lot of the men would be burnt with ash on their skin. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, there's a lot of, we don't know exactly how he got off the Titanic when it sank, but we know that when he went down, when he was on the Titanic, when he come off the Titanic, he had got frostbitten toes. So at some point, either whether it was in the boiler rooms or he'd come into contact with the sea at some point. We think, a lot of people think he was in lifeboat 15, but that we don't know for sure which lifeboat or how he got off the Titanic.
Around 15 to 20 minutes later, there was nothing but stillness and quiet. Some survivors wanted to help the people in the water. Sadly, most lifeboats never returned to pick up survivors. However, Lifeboat 4 did, and it was in that boat, with the suggestion by Madeline Astor, that a familiar face would save another man's life. Frank was still in the water, swimming around the cries of people screaming for help. When he was spotted by the crew and passengers on lifeboat number 4, he was put into the lifeboat. And while he was in, he was surprised when he saw Virginia Clark.
By the grace of God, I came across a lifeboat, and they pulled me in. And there was a fireman dead in the bottom, and there was about a foot of water in this boat. There was another man who was trying to. He seemed to be trying to get away from it again. I don't know what was the matter with him. They were tying him down, and the rest were women and children. And I sat on a seat, and I sat next to Mrs. Clark, the girl I'd put into a lifeboat. I was in a pretty bad way then, as you can imagine. Frozen solid almost, and she wrapped me round with a cloak. She had some sort of blanket or a coat on. Anyway, I think she probably saved my life, I don't know, but I saved hers. At least I think I might have done. I think I did, and she saved mine.
However, she lost her husband in the sinking, as did Madeline Astor. It was estimated that out of the 2,208 passengers and crew who were on board the Titanic, 1,517 lives were lost. One of those lost was second-class stewardess Lucy Snape. During the sinking, Lucy was fastening lifebelts on her passengers before she wished them goodbye. Later on, Lucy told some of the stewardesses that she did not expect to see them again. Loretta Ann Miller, host of the podcast Titanic, explains her thoughts on Lucy.
I'm such an empathic person,
that when I know that people are going through a hard time, I will be like, put my stuff aside and I need to care for them and I'll figure out what's going to happen with me later. I feel like I can understand her thinking of that, of, you know what, I was put on this ship to do a job and something is going wrong and it is still my job to take care of the passengers, and that is what I'm going to do.
There was little that anyone can do to help the people who perished in the water. So, leaving them, the 706 survivors in the lifeboats began to wait for rescue. So, leaving them, the 706 survivors in the lifeboats began to wait for a rescue ship. While they were waiting, many passengers had very different experiences in each lifeboat. Lifeboat 11, the heaviest lifeboat, had no lamp, so a sailor lit a piece of rope using it as a signal. In Lifeboat 13, Lawrence Beasley describes the events that happened following the sinking and what happened when a mysterious ship came to their rescue.
In the absence of any plan of action, we rowed slowly forward, or at least in the general direction that the Titanic's bow had pointed. We felt in the darkness for a light to signal with, also for food and water. We found nothing. About 3:30 a.m., someone in the bow called our attention to a faint, faraway gleam in the southeast. And then a distant boom sounded across the water. The stoker, who had lain all night under the tiller, sat up suddenly, as if from a dream. That was a cannon. With every sense alert, we waited in absolute silence until, creeping over the edge of the sea, we saw a single light and presently a second one below. And in a few moments they were well above the horizon and they remained in line. We didn't know what sort of vessel was coming, but we knew she was coming quickly, and we searched for paper, rags, anything that would burn, our coats if necessary. A hasty paper torch was twisted out of a bundle of letters, lighted and held aloft by our captain. Our faces were dimly illuminated, as was the water surrounding our boat, and I saw for the first time the cause of our present circumstances: ice. The ship stopped some distance away and slowly swung round to reveal herself as a large steamer with all her portholes alight.
Where lagging stream sings lullaby, there blows a lily fair. The twilight gleam is in her eyes, the night is on her hair, and like a lovesick Lennon she hath my heart in thrall. No life I own, nor liberty, with love is Lord of all. And sometimes when the beetle's horn hath lulled the eve to sleep, I steal unto her shieling lorn, and through the drink peep.
And then came the dawn.
There on the cricket's singing stone she stirs the bogwood fire, and hums in soft sweet undertone the song of heart's desire.
We drew near to the ship and could make out the bands on her funnel which told she was a Cunarder. Some boats were already at her side by the time we were close enough to read her name. Carpathia.
Next time on Titanic, Titan of the Sea, what happened on board the Carpathia when Cunard's little steamer came to the Titanic's rescue?
They both said independently that the saddest thing was seeing the women of the Titanic line the rail of the Carpathia as each lifeboat pulled up.
Who was to blame for the disaster? And I begin doing some detective work to give my own theory on whether the inquiries were the subject of yellow journalism.
The whole thing about the people saying the ship sank in one piece.
He was only doing what he was told to do.
Doing one in the middle of the ocean is inconvenient. You have to stop the ship.